issues and built it by synthesizing her knowledge with what was really needed at the grassroots level, particularly with women. So she forms these cooperatives and these collectives. She does these walks through the forest and teaches ladies how to recognize fallen debris and fallen wood that could be used for fuel, how to identify tree species, which ones in certain ages need to be preserved, which can go, and then went further to build cooperatives on how to grow nurseries, how to really install ecologically sensitive forest habitats, but also was a huge advocate for women's rights in Kenya, for equal rights for women there, and was beaten up by the police, arrested, everything. Was actually a target of the president at that time. But through her labors and her work, 51 million trees later, she effectively created a network of cooperatives that if you look at time-lapse photography in Google Earth and other images, you can see the Sahel, which is where this part of the country is, pushing back. That not only was it reversing deforestation, it was reversing desertification, and became the basis of the work that's going on with the Green Wall going across the Sahel, across the entire continent of Africa. So by dealing with a broad array of issues that weren't necessarily in her wheelhouse, right? She's dealing with the legacy of colonialism. She's dealing with the legacy of unequal rights between men and women. And she's simulating through this process a bit of participatory democracy, which is people don't have to wait and go through representation and deal with policies in order to affect change. It's whoever wants to learn about trees and about ecosystems, who has the time and the energy to put in that sweat equity, they can participate. And so she always stuck with me as I started to move through landscape architecture and think about resilience in the broader sense, that often we think about resilience as protection from sea level rise or protection from climate change. And then we really focus on the technical execution of physical infrastructures that landscape architects and other design professionals are experts in. And we specialize in deploying those to deal with these issues. And I'm not going to diminish that. I think that's correct. But I think that as we start to venture out into the broader world, we'll find that there are other needs and there are other ways that people are being resilient. This diagram comes from research from Superstorm Sandy. So the huge storm that hit New Jersey and New York and the Northeast several years ago. And they were trying to figure out why some communities were bouncing back faster than others, which is to say, as a measure of resilience, that's one definition, is how you recover from disruption, right? How you recover from trauma. Doesn't necessarily suggest going back to the way you were, but it suggests that you have overcome some of the challenges that came from a trauma. So they came up with this matrix and they said, hey, the places where you knew your neighbors, where you had a network and you knew cell phones, where you knew each other's children, where you had a lot of long-term social ties, were the places that recovered quicker. And so what really is an accurate measure of the most resilient communities, at least in this study, was the measure of social cohesion. In the model, they talk about three components. They talk about social mobility, social capital, social exclusion. So social exclusion, right? So when you look at a group of folks, how included are they within the basic processes? How equal or equitable are their life standards based on where they are in society? Social capital, how much trust is in that community or between communities? How active are they civically, right? In terms of participating in political advocacy or other forms of advocacy. And then mobility, so the economic component of how are the generations moving forward, accumulating more wealth, accumulating more resources, accumulating more physical capital that allows them to thrive. And so it's these three domains that overlap and become social cohesion, which starts to balance the technical skill set that we have. I don't know how many of you are from the South. I'm not. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. Malcolm X used to call that up South, so I guess it was South. But it's not South like North Carolina where I am today. And it's something that I've learned to adapt to, but also learn from. And I think there's some lessons being in the South that the rest of the country can learn from right now, and even the world as we start to deal with the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. This is a really famous image from Gordon Parks, a great photographer. This is actually Mobile, Alabama. And it's an image I show a lot of people who aren't from the South to talk about the South. So what you see is an elegantly dressed lady and her child on not a beautiful, but an adequate streetscape, you know, active concerns, businesses, things of that nature. And, you know, you look at it and you're like, everything's cool. And then you see this, right? And then you wonder about that idea of being composed, being dignified, feeling like you're a part of something when everything around you is telling that you're not, and encoded messages. And so today the aren't as overt. The overt ones are coming down, and we'll talk about that in a second. But we still operate in these worlds where we could be in the exact same place, experiencing the exact same physical environment, but having a totally different perception of it, a totally different sense of belonging, and a totally different sense of agency. And I think that with resilience, we're kind of dealing with that. Now, in the broader scheme of things, you know, this image is from years ago. So at the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, which really talked about can broader society be said to be working, be said to be democratic, said to be equitable, if we can't prevent the unnecessary killing and death of Black people? Is that an indicator of the health of broader society? And it started as a hashtag movement. Some people didn't really take it seriously. They didn't really have demands. There wasn't a leadership. So, you know, years ago, it was really kind of nebulous for a lot of folks who weren't involved with it. You know, they were, not unlike their forebears, the civil rights movement, experts at the use of media. So there's a lot of research about the modern civil rights movement, what's known as the Second Reconstruction, you know, the era when Dr. King and the SCLC and a lot of other organizations were active, which was using media, using images to essentially shame society and to correct action. The underlying assumption is that we have a moral center, and by showing a mirror to our ugliness, that it would shock us into moral action. And in their own way, they kind of have dealt with that using broader imagery. Where you are in Virginia is one of the most important spots in the current movement, right? So this is in Richmond, you know, and the decision to remove the Lee statue. But in the interim, its use as a place to really have this contested notion of where we are and what we're about is indicative of that. So people may be doing it on cell phones, people may be doing it inside of buildings, but largely people are looking at the landscape as the place where that occurs. And so in a lot of ways, it places some centrality to what we do and who we are. And of course, it remains contested. So this is from several days ago in the Washington Post. Some of you may know, if you've gone to Washington, D.C. at all, or know about it generally, that the mayor of Washington, D.C. Authorized the creation of Black Lives Matter Plaza right at the footsteps of the White House. A big enough image you can see it from satellite, which is unbelievable. And so for, you know, several weeks, you know, it was generally thought of as a good, but in the context of Confederate monuments coming down, new symbols coming up, it's unleashed, you know, another response, another reaction of people contesting those places, contrasting with a newer one in New York City. This one is in Lower Manhattan, but was done in a more integrative process where there were levels of government that were cooperating and working on this. There was an effort to hire local artists, particularly artists of color and Black artists. There were groups of people that invested more than just the paint in order to create a symbol, but also simulate, again, this sort of sense of participatory democracy, that not only is it the artifact they're creating, which is the plaza, but it's the networks and the systems and the relationships that are being built through this, in which case, highly unlikely that this is going to be vandalized or targeted, because there are just too many people that are advocating in this interest, supporting it and using it. So, you know, we're in the domain of a lot of this. Some of this conversation is really old in terms of resilience. And this is a recent article I wrote with a colleague, Julian Edgerman, who's at Tufts University, he's an urban planner. And we were looking at the legacy of what's known as the Black Commons. A lot of what we're seeing today is, in some cases, the effective work of what's called racial capitalism, which is the founding of this nation, not unlike Brad's introduction, you know, was on stolen land, colonialism, right? And that the original wealth of our country was stolen labor, African enslaved labor. So that's in the DNA of who we are. That feeds every aspect of what we do. But even in the face of that, immediately after emancipation, particularly Black folks formed their own towns, their own communities, their own universities, bought land, huge farmland, built cooperatives. There's a lot written about the legacy of people not being victims, But in the midst of an unjust society, using the landscape as a mechanism to build wealth, to build social cohesion, to build structure in institutions. You know, the sad part is that land loss has particularly plagued African American and Black communities, which is to say, over 98% of rural land that was once owned by Black people across the country immediately after emancipation is gone. There's no real record or real archive of urban or suburban land. But when you think about the role that land plays in wealth building, in economic activities that can pass along skills, in terms of community stability, losing 98% of that resource, land value today at about $1 trillion. And all that work that could have done in the last century to help pass on generational wealth. It's a huge problem and a huge issue. So the land is central to that as well. My good friend Mindy Fulilov, who wrote some amazing books, the one that I would recommend the most is relevant to this conversation is called Root Shock. What it talks about is the psychological impact of losing your home place. And it was based on her long-term research in New York City, particularly in the era of the rise of AIDS and the destruction of the South Bronx. Destruction of the South Bronx in New York gave birth to hip hop culture. Thankful for that, anybody who loves hip hop. But the downside is that it really left a long-term psychological wound on people who were displaced, dislocated through urban renewal, freeway construction. She also did research in Pittsburgh in the Hill District and saw the exact same pattern. So this root shock phenomenon, losing your roots, almost like a plant. What happens to a plant when it's removed from the soil and it's exposed to the elements, it withers. She makes that analogy to people and how we think about things. So in particular in Black communities, she points to specific eras, you know, ranging from slavery to current issues of gentrification as what she calls serial displacement, this continuous uprooting of communities over and over again, disrupting their ability to be landed, to be focused and to be organized. And this is just one measure, but when we talk about a lot of things, for example, why are there so few African Americans, Native Americans involved in landscape architecture? Why are there so few Black folks in any of the built environmental professions? Why, right? So one component is wealth and the differential in wealth. So this diagram is actually projecting to 2004. The data ended in about 2014 or 15. This particular study, but you can see even at that date, the huge disparity in median household wealth between white folks, Black folks, and Latino folks, and the projections, the forecasts. And admittedly, this is before COVID and before everything that's happened in the world, but we're talking about 100 to 1. So when we're wondering why people show up at meetings and there's a certain demographic advocating for interest in the land or property or ownership, or why there are certain numbers in college and not, or certain numbers in home ownership or business startups, the differential in wealth tied to serial displacement is one of those factors, which led to this article, which was written for UC Berkeley several years ago in their Ground Up Student Journal, but came out of a conference that Walter Hood at Berkeley called of the same name. And in deference to Walter, there's a book called Black Landscapes Matter coming out this year through UVA Press. So there we go, there's another UVA tie. But this one tried to start to make these cases and tried to use the language of the Black Lives Matter movement at that time as a way to bridge this gap between our technical know-how and our expertise in landscape architecture and the imperative that we have for better socio-cultural understanding and tools. And this comes from Alicia Garza, who is one of the 3 co-founders of Black Lives Matter, and in a panel that she was giving, talking about the core of what they're talking about. She said these things, right? The goals of Black Lives Matter: to be seen, to live with dignity, and to be connected. And I'm going to use these 3 prompts for the remainder of the talk. So we're probably about 15 minutes away from the end. As Brad mentioned, I am from Detroit, Michigan. This is a picture from the Detroit River, looking back at the Detroit skyline and downtown. Belle Isle Park, which was initially designed by Frederick Olmsted, but just like most great designers in Detroit, they got ran out of town. So Frederick Olmsted started the design of Belle Isle Park when it was Hog Island, and then the rich people in Detroit got mad, ran them out. Happened to Dan Kiley, happened to everybody you can name from the mid century got ran out of town. But it's an incredible resource, an 800-acre island park right off of the coast of the city. And, you know, that's what we did. We played in the shallows of the Detroit River and we enjoyed the city, you know. And, you know, Detroit and Metro Detroit in particular in the early and mid 20th century was one of the most important design centers in the world. Every contemporary modernist designer you can name has work in Detroit. This is from the Saarinen office, Ilya and Eero Saarinen, who designed Cranbrook Academy of the Arts in Birmingham, about 16 miles north of the Detroit River. A gorgeous modernist campus that's even today very meticulously maintained. And it stands as one of the great mid-century design sites in the world today. But Detroit was also home to these kinds of things. You know, so this is the Heidelberg Project. You know, and this was done by Tyree Guyton, who was a guerrilla artist, self-taught, inspired by the ghost of his dead father, who told him to paint polka dots everywhere in Detroit, and started with, even without permission, getting buckets of paint and painting polka dots on streets. And then he's painting polka dots on houses. And then he's stapling baby dolls and bicycles to trees. And no one knows why. He's moved by the spirit. But for a number of years, it was the #1 tourist attraction in the city of Detroit. It inspired Mercedes-Benz to design their whole exhibition for the Detroit Auto Show, inspired by the Heidelberg. There's components of this work all over the world now, talking about this other side. When you look at it conceptually, you're really dealing with opposites. This is about capital, wealth, control, and really the desired outcomes for a lot of people in terms of landscape architecture or order. This one is not. This is the other side of capitalism. This is about accumulation, cast off, waste. In his case, one of the projects he worked on initially was he created the Numbers House, painting numbers on a house where they did drug deals in the community. The numbers on the house turned it into an art object, which created too much attention, which scared away the drug dealers. So believe it or not, this sort of approach actually helped and provided social and community benefit. Sadly, a lot of this work was vandalized and victims of arson, and is slowly being disassembled by the artist himself as he strategizes a new place. But those extremes existed where I grew up. But these extremes as well, and so I know I mentioned displacement before, but I wanted to give a more concrete example. In the early 20th century, this area, Hastings Street in Detroit, was one of the thriving business districts, but was predominantly African-American, if not all, in a community called Black Bottom. Black Bottom, not because of the color of people's skin, but the reference to the soil on which it was built. So just on the eastern fringe of downtown Detroit. In the 50s, when we got urban renewal and freeway construction, that's the exact same spot, right? So that's the creation of 75, the Chrysler Expressway. And what you'll find is that there are hundreds of communities where the #1 litmus test for how to disrupt people's cycles to accommodate modernism, right? Things are moving to cars, things are moving to regions, things are moving to rational planning, were Black communities. There's an incredible website called Freeways Without Futures that catalogs communities across the United States and how clearly these decisions were made on the basis of race. That they intentionally targeted Black communities near city centers for a lot of the things that we enjoy today: freeways, housing projects, other components of rational planning. So that disruption is real. And if you can imagine this happening essentially every generation since slavery ended. So Jim Crow, redlining, urban renewal, and today gentrification. And although we like to point at traffic engineers and architects and urban planners and politicians for doing it, we have to acknowledge that landscape architects were complicit in this as well. This is one of our superheroes in landscape architecture. For people who might be learning about landscape architecture for the first time, this is Frederick Olmsted. His 200th birthday is coming up in 2022, so in 2 years, we'll be celebrating 200 years of it. He rose to prominence in many ways: National Park Service, most known for Prospect Park, Central Park. Really a giant, you know, in terms of landscape architecture. Before he became a landscape architect, was a writer and a journalist. And he wrote for what eventually became the New York Times. He was an abolitionist, and he wrote under a pen name in the South. His writings are collected in this book called The Cotton Kingdom, an amazing book that talks about his journal moving through. He was walking along plantations. He's writing about all these issues, you know, pretty progressive when you look at the writing. There's some nuances. There's a scholar in particular named J.T. Rohn who's been very critical of these letters, which we can talk about later. But generally speaking, had an abolitionist tone, meaning that, no, he was not reinforcing and saying that slavery was great, it was horrible. He was trying to sort of be the spy talking that story. But around the same time, he's traveling through Europe. This was the son of a relatively wealthy family. He's in Europe when they're starting to open up royal grounds that were reserved for royal families, particularly in England, for public people. Now, why would they do that? Well, during the Industrial Revolution, with large throngs of working class people trying to live as close as they can to the centers and where jobs are, whereas the owners of that capital had estates on the fringes of cities, so they could be in the middle of industrialized hard work, but then they could escape. They could restore themselves on the fringes of cities in these gardens. Olmsted was there, and he's wondering if by opening these royal grounds, which were in the central cities, could that have, in his words, a civilizing effect? People were concerned about insurrection, protest, organizing against sort of the capitalists at that time, and felt that providing access to light, to air, to calm, to connection with nature would help them and make them become more whole people, but also bring some social control. So he's observing this, right? So he's got this legacy of going south and seeing these injustices in the United States. Then he's going to Europe and he's seeing all these public lands open up. And he comes back. He's superintendent of Central Park. Central Park as an idea was conceived by Andrew Jackson Downing, a generation before him. But they have a design competition, and miraculously, Olmsted and Calvert Vaux win the competition. It was rigged, obviously. But it gave birth to the Greensward Plan, which was one of the first major proponents of public parks in the United States, a rural park in the city, intentionally designed to contrast with the gridiron. And one thing to look at here is at the time that Central Park was constructed, none of the skyline that you see was there. Right? Development in the island of Manhattan ended at the south end of Central Park, which is in the upper right of that picture. There was no New York City beyond that boundary. And everything in nothing in Central Park except for the rocks that are there today were there before. Every blade of grass was planted, every tree was planted, every waterway was carved out by machines and by hand. So there's nothing natural about Central Park. It was a stylized representation of rural life, wedged into the city, anticipating that the city would grow and require that resource. So a lot of forethought. Before Central Park was built, there was a community called Seneca Village. There were a number of self-built communities in the footprint of Central Park at that time. People couldn't afford to live within the boundaries of the city. People who, because of policies, either racist or sexist, weren't allowed to live within the boundaries of the city, lived in Central Park. So Seneca Village was one of those. Several hundred people founded and organized by Black people. That community was completely erased and destroyed as a part of construction of Central Park. What's interesting about it is when you read testimonies and discussions at the time of what people were saying about Central Park. Not everyone was in love with Central Park. Here's one from 1848. This is maybe 9 years before they started construction of Central Park. Will anyone pretend the park is not a scheme to enhance the value of uptown land, create a splendid center for fashionable life without regard to or even in dereliction of the happiness of the multitude upon whose hearts and hands the expenses will fall? So there were critics at the time as well. One of my professors at Michigan, Dorceta Taylor, wrote a lot of great books dealing with environmental justice. This is one that I like a lot, The Environment and the People in American Cities, where she's trying to figure out, in her mind, the origins of the mainstream environmental movement in the United States, why mainstream environmentalism continues to exclude African Americans and other groups of people. And in her research and her investigations, she talks a lot about Central Park. And just full disclosure, she don't like landscape architects or landscape architecture that much. very critical of it. And even in this book, she is. But you can start to see why when she talks about this plan. So, you know, Downing comes up with the big picture vision of a central park, a rural park in the city for New York City. Olmsted and Vox execute it. What were other people doing at the time? Well, she goes through workers' rights organizations, women's rights organizations, other groups, and it turns out they had their own plans. And their idea was not one central park, but multiple central parks, plural. And that those were supposed to be tied to the places where they self-identified, hey, I need a place for my kids to play. You know, the sanitation issues are horrible. We need to clean that up. They were trying to scale and direct those open spaces to the places where people needed them. And they lost, obviously, politically, to the bigger idea of a centralized park. And there's still lingering inequalities and inequities in terms of park and open space access, not just in Manhattan, but throughout New York City. So it's not to malign it because, you know, sometimes playing what's called Monday morning quarterback and revising everything is contentious. But it is fair to say that Central Park was not the only idea. And at the time that Central Park was being hatched, there were other ideas about how open space could be better connected to people and the actual needs of people at that time. And that was being advocated by women, by people of color, and by others. So this idea of current issues, right? You'll hear something about green gentrification. You'll hear about, hey, communities resisting developing new bike lanes, new parks, new neighborhoods, because they're afraid that they're gonna get pushed out, either through property taxes or other things. Well, it's important to acknowledge that it's in the DNA of our profession, at least in the United States, because one of our most important initial and most iconic public works was grounded on the bedrock of displacement. So we get to this topic of to be seen, right? And that's one thing I would pass along to you as you start to move on your journey in landscape architecture, is to think about the invisible issues, people, things that are in the place, but lack a voice, lack documentation, lack power, lack form. And when we pay attention to those things, we're contributing to a more democratic conversation. So moving forward, you know, the High Line, which was wildly, well, before COVID, wildly successful, actually it's reopening. I just saw that last week. They're gonna reopen it in phased reopening. An abandoned rail line moving through New York City, through the meatpacking district, you know, a great amenity. Produced what was called the High Line effect, which is hotly debated, which is adjacent private property values went up 500% when they put in this public amenity. And happened again with the Atlanta Beltline, which at its peak was the largest public works project going on in the United States. Abandoned rail line that ringed the central city of Atlanta. Ryan Gravel, who at that time was a graduate student at Georgia Tech, his master's project is, hey, let's turn this abandoned rail line into places to deal with stormwater, places that provide affordable housing, places that do remediation of environmental damage, that can create jobs. He has a sort of, you know, no disrespect to students like yourselves, but a very kind of naive and optimistic kind of way of looking at it. So believe it or not, the people in the city of Atlanta were like, man, this is an incredible idea. We got to do this. They find billions of dollars and they've been working on it for a decade, right? An amazing transformative project. Ryan also reached out to Nathaniel Smith and others, anticipating that equity was going to be an issue, learning from previous lessons of displacement and saying, hey, we got to make sure that after we build this, the people that are least enfranchised, that are closest to this, that would benefit from this, can stay. But failed miserably, and to the point where Ryan and Nathaniel both resigned from the board of the Beltline, which is to say he created the Beltline and walked away from it because he saw the damage that was being done, that there wasn't enough accommodation to displacement. In Durham, we learned from this as we contemplated our own abandoned rail line, which rings our downtown, transforming that into an urban trail. And with huge community resistance, learning from the Atlanta Beltline, saying, hey, before you even work on this or plan this, there's a lot of stability that needs to happen in adjacent communities such that people have the opportunity to stay in place when this is built. One of the examples that we all cited, which we're all still watching, is 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C. The old 11th Street Bridge, which is getting decommissioned, design competition won by OMA and Olin to convert it into a pedestrian center connecting across the Anacostia River. But learning from these other lessons, knew that they were going to have a huge impact, and said that beyond the usual technical scope of landscape architecture, we have to get involved in a lot of domains that we don't always do. We have to get involved in job creation, in neighborhood stabilization, in business development, a lot of these tools. So they put together a huge list of partners, JPB Foundation, LISC, a lot of others, and they issued this equitable development plan, which in part is a 10-year plan, which starts 5 years before construction of this bridge starts. It has elements of things to do before, things to do during, things to do after. So once this begins, this will be our first real example in real time of how we can play additional roles in anticipating the economic and potentially disruptive impacts of our public work, and not only anticipate them, but address them. One thing that's important, and then I'll move on because I know time is moving on, is that the impact area of this project was a lesson to us in Durham and to many other communities. On the left of that slide is a little yellow star, and that's the bridge. That's the actual project. However, when they did their analysis, they discovered that all of the green are the census tracts that will be impacted by the development of that bridge in terms of ripple effects, in terms of more desirability for new housing or new residents or new business creation. And so that vast area for that little tiny spot is something to think about as you start to move into public work, is that the area of impact is much bigger than you think it is. We'll get through the second section and then I'll stop. I had a bit more, but I want to respect everyone's time. So I have about 6 more minutes left before I want to stop and open it up.
Feel free, Kofi, to move on to whatever you want. We have plenty of time, just so you know.
Oh, okay. Well, appreciate it. Thanks, Brad. Appreciate it. Got a little out of control. All right. So this is one of my heroes, and actually we just talked last week. We were on a call together last week. This is Ann Wiston-Stern, who has done a lot of work, but probably is best known for her work while she was at University of Pennsylvania. She's at MIT now. And here she is standing in West Philadelphia. And she was one of the pioneers of a process that I really enjoy, that I think you all would benefit from learning about and knowing as well. In the 80s, when she was at Penn, there was a murder. University of Pennsylvania is in West Philadelphia. And at that time, it was sort of a high crime neighborhood for a lot of reasons. So the president of Penn organized sort of a town hall, and Penn at that time was not very well connected to the community around it. It was more like a walled off Ivy League school. So they were creating incentives to get people to kind of go beyond the wall and engage the surrounding community. And people did. And so Ann was one of those. She was in landscape architecture. And one of the things she started to do was interview people in the neighborhoods, encourage them to do surveys of their homes, and got really involved with the local elementary school, trying to figure out what was up. One of her discoveries technically was that Mill Creek, which goes through this neighborhood, was many years ago filled in and put in a pipe. And that pipe went under people's houses and homes. When she went and did a bunch of surveys with grad students of homes, she started to notice a pattern of homes that were literally falling into the ground. Sinkholes would also slow sort of disassembly due to the fact that these are built on top of the creek. So what she discovered was, and this is early GIS, which explains sort of the crudity of some of these GIS diagrams, is that you could map the decline of this neighborhood based on its proximity to Mill Creek. So one thing that happened was, well, what do we do about it? And she said, well, maybe we can think about how to teach the next generation of people in this neighborhood about as you start to deal with long-term planning or long-term thinking about the sustainability of your community, is to understand how ecology actually works. Is to understand history in terms of how communities were designed. And this community was intentionally put on top of the creek because it was low value, right? So they make an agreement with the local principal at the elementary school. They start to impact the curriculum. So using Mill Creek and learning about Mill Creek as a way to ground STEM education in the school, their science and math scores go through the roof. So that relevance of learning about their own communities gave relevance to the learning and improved their performance. We start doing DIY projects. You see a couple of young men there hoisting up materials for a community garden, which still exists. Rain gardens, a lot of really comprehensive stuff. So they start to enable and catalyze all of these community actions that were independent at that point of a Penn and their involvement. This is from the issue Landscape Architecture a couple of years ago. This is one of the remaining community gardens from over 25 years ago that we visited when we were there for ASLA. That's might be the last time I saw Brad, was actually as a part of the Philly ASLA. So you see this gentleman here gardening. One thing that's funny is that the day we were there, years later, the same guy was there. So this is the same guy that's in the picture on the left. And we had the magazine with us and we gave him the magazine. It was like, hey, look, man, you're there. You're in that picture. And he's getting a big kick out of it. So he thought that was really funny. I think that's funny. But it shows the resilience. He's been there for a long time. That place has provided value and stability for a long time. Their vision was to unearth the creek, right? So it was irresponsible for the growth of the community to bury this thing, and it's led to all these long-term challenges. And so that was a proposal to do so. Unfortunately, for a lot of reasons, it never happened. But it's an idea of how, once again, engaging issues where they are, finding out the issues that are really driving people and concerning people, blend with our technical skill set and allow us to take leaps moving forward. We learned from that here, you know, where we are in North Carolina. There's a term called racialized topography, which is the subject of another time. But the idea that in the South, there was a study done of over 100 Southern communities. And with the exception of a few communities, primarily those on the coast, you could correlate race and elevation, which is to say higher elevations in a lot of Southern towns, predominantly white. Lower elevations, predominantly black and brown, for a lot of reasons. But our city actually responds to that. And this is from a diagram from the 1960s, which talked about the city in the park, which was the master plan concept for Raleigh, where the state capitol was intentionally placed on the highest point between two valleys, Walnut Creek, Crabtree Creek. Walnut Creek became the area self-built by African Americans who, at the founding of the time of the city of Raleigh, were not allowed to live within the city boundaries, but were connected to it economically for work, for employment, for other kinds of exchanges. And so these self-built areas in low-lying areas are the norm in our region. There's an aerial that shows that area today, bridging Walnut Creek. And something that I want to bring up is, as you get further into your education, you'll start to see how maps really matter. The blue in that map are called floodways. Those are areas guaranteed to flood, you know, on a certain frequency. The pink are flood plains. These are areas that can flood as well in serious storms. So after Hurricane Floyd in our region, the dam that holds Lake Raleigh together on our campus at NC State broke and released all that water, and it moved from the left of that diagram to the right and inundated this community, right? That was self-built many years ago in the floodplain. And it became an issue because other parts of Raleigh flooded in the same storm. Those areas, the city agreed to make the repairs and to restore those particular communities. In this community, they said, hey, we're gonna increase your water bills and your property taxes to build a fund that we can draw from the fund to then pay for improvements. And that inequity led to the birth of an organization called Partners for Environmental Justice, who said it's unfair that a community in the exact same condition received city attention when we have to pay extra for something that was not our fault. strictly on the basis of race. They won that. The city came back and did that. But they went further and they said, hey, one thing we need to do is not just fight and resist, but we need to speculate and propose on the value of what we have. And it turned out that Walnut Creek is the closest and healthiest forested wetland to downtown Raleigh. They said, this is an incredible amenity. There's a chance for us to tell our story. It's built on freedmen's land. That's what these communities were built upon, which was first land that African Americans could buy right after slavery to own. So there's a cultural story with it, but there's also an ecological story. And if more people understood the value of low-lying areas, wetlands, and ecosystem services, then we would make smarter decisions and better understand each other moving forward. It's a very progressive thing that they talked about in the 90s. They got a bond issue passed. And this is the Wetland Education Center as it exists today in the exact same spot that flooded. Named after Norman and Betty Camp, who were the leader and co-leader of Partners for Environmental Justice. Dr. Camp recently passed away, grew up in the neighborhood, developed an ecological affection based on playing in the creeks and having that lifestyle as a child, which led to his awareness as an adult. And this place exposes thousands of people, particularly school children in Wake County, to the history of the neighborhood, but also the value of the wetland every day. These are some of the interactive projects that are going on in the neighborhood, inspired by that piece. This is a rain garden being installed at a local church, St. Ambrose Church. This is a workshop that my students led as we teamed up with Parks with Purpose as a part of the Conservation Fund to extend and expand the spaces and the public realm associated with the history of Walnut Creek, using a series of engagement strategies from on the left, things a little more familiar, using dots and notes, to composing images using acetate overlays, to the one that's probably most inventive. Olivia on the lower right is sitting there with the resident, and they were using dioramas and collecting oral histories, having people compose stories about what they enjoyed about places. The good part about all this is that it helped the community, who had a lot of divergent goals, converge on a few that were most important, and then select a site. So there were many places being considered about where to intervene. And through a series of workshops like this, interactive, they were able to get to what we wanted and where we wanted it, which enabled another phase, which is being led by Design Workshop right now, to actually implement some of those changes to increase flood protection, but also increase access to Walnut Creek and opportunities to celebrate local history and local stories. So this went from activism to speculative work to now real. So this time next year, COVID willing, a lot of really positive change will be coming to this particular community. And I'm gonna close with this last one because I wanna get to the question and answer. I know there's more time, but I think it's been a lot, so I wanna make sure we get to it. And I'll say that I never used the word dignity as a kid, or even in the North. It's a term that I grew to appreciate, dignity and grace, by living in the South. So understanding that there are groups of people who have had to live with such incredible injustice and still carry themselves as if they were, to not bend to that evil and to hold themselves in that regard. So in the recent passing of John Lewis, great example of that, where you think about how we got to know John Lewis. He got beaten nearly to death on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. If you've ever seen the Selma movie or know anything about Selma, Alabama, that's how he kind of rose to prominence, is his resilience for bouncing back from that and not being bitter, not being vengeful, but working triple and quadruply hard to make the sense of democracy that was in his head that drove him real. So, dignity is a really important term to me. And I think it was really great that Alicia Garza kind of spoke to that. We've talked a bit about South Park. This is another South Park story that speaks to that. It's about John Chavis Memorial Park. And this is the park's location in context of downtown. It's walking distance to downtown Raleigh, and the surrounding neighborhood, South Park, built on freedmen's land, It was the green hub of it, still is. The reason why I'm bringing this up is that it talks about the roles that landscape architecture can play in revealing stories that add value and then add power to groups. So we talked about that once. The Partners for Environmental Justice, going to talk about it a bit with the South Park story. The South Park neighborhood was built as a streetcar suburb, but a segregated one. So there were 5 streetcar suburbs built around downtown Raleigh. One of them, this one, South Park, was strictly for African Americans and was one of the first mixed-use master plan developments in the city, if not the first one, because it included public housing, schools, other facilities, and a large park. It was known as the Negro Park. And the open space that you see there was the track and the football fields for 2 historically Black colleges, universities, Shaw University, St. Augustine's College, as well as the Negro League baseball team, which used it as their field. So it had a lot going on within the stand of that community. Growth and development in downtown Raleigh was, of course, putting pressure on those neighborhoods, and new plans were developed for Chavis Park. The picture at the bottom is Chavis Park in the 1920s. So to give you a sense historically of the amenities there. And what's important, which is not in these slides, is that it was the Black Park. So in the separate but unequal days of Jim Crow, there were separate facilities for whites and blacks. The white park, Pullen Park, was a mile away, had the exact same amenities, Olympic-sized pool, carousel, various amusements. But over time, after desegregation, Pullen Park was recognized as the park for everyone. Chavis Park was diminished, and so elements were removed from Chavis Park. The pool was removed, the amusements were removed. And one of the last things to move was that carousel that you see in the front center on the left, that new shelter. That carousel used to occupy a different part of the park. You can see a little bit of it in this image way off to the right. You can see people standing in line over what looks like a canopy. That's where it used to be. And the relocation of this facility triggered a huge eruption of community resistance. And it was interesting because we didn't go into this collaboration with this community focused on the park at all. We were focused on the surrounding community. And not only were people not focused on the park, they were focused on the specifics of this carousel moving. So we had to stop everything that we were doing and reorganize and say, well, why is everybody upset about this carousel? Well, it turns out it's because it was the last vestige of the heart of the park as they knew it. It was the last real tangible element from what was the original intent and content of the park. And, you know, there are a lot of layers to stories, and sometimes they come out in different ways, but one that came out was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was founded at Shaw University, which is 2 blocks away from this park. Ella Baker, Stokely Carmichael, a lot of great people, really the next wave, the next generation after the SCLC, started with activities in the park. This picture is from Mississippi, but they did the same thing in Chavis Park, which is to say they wanted to simulate how to respond to violent attacks, nonviolent direct action in the face of incredible hostility. So they did simulations of walking alone and how to defend yourself, how to deal with, you know, aggression. They used the park before they actually dealt with it in other places. We didn't know that until we engaged in a really, I won't say random, but a really sort of ancillary activity. We were struggling to figure out why this carousel and why this park mattered. It wasn't well documented here. The community meetings weren't really helping to kind of elucidate this. So we were like, well, can we find a way to engage people while they're on the space, like actually in the park? Right? Can they tell us stories about what happened while they're standing there? And so I know this isn't in the park, this is in a nearby community center, but these ladies who grew up in that era are learning for the first time, first, how to use a smartphone, because none of them had smartphones. Second, how to record self-authored digital videos, and then how to map them, how to geolocate them, so that you can tell a story that links to a map and you have a talking map. That is the oral histories of the story. So this is a small sample of some of those videos that exist online, and we like free stuff, so this is all Google. You click on the icons and it tells you a story in their own words. We got 60 of these stories, right? And this is a newer version of the map. It's been regenerated a few times. But it's really started to spread that story out about why the carousel mattered and where it was, what the heart of the park was, you know, how people thought about the creek that ran through there, crazy events like dance parties and other things. And believe it or not, those stories had power. The city changed their entire community engagement process because of the willpower of these people, and started to create citizens councils that would parallel and be compensated, not just free volunteer, but actually paid to participate in the planning of not just the new Chavis Park, but all parks in the city of Raleigh. So those folks cheering because the plan got approved. And I don't know how many people are familiar with anybody in the picture, but there's a lady kind of right center, Vernice Miller Travis, who at that time was at Skio Solutions, which was at that time in Charlottesville, but who's one of the pioneers of the environmental justice movement. She's one of the founders of We Act in West Harlem, who then became a professional planner, and that's how we got to know each other, was co-facilitating this particular process. So not only did they get the master plan approved, they got a $12.5 million bond issue, and those stories were used as a part of the case for the designation of the park on the National Register of Historic Places. So in 3 years' time, by being able to pivot and address the direct community needs that we didn't understand, but really being willing to deploy our thinking and our tools to that, it got resources, the community got power, and historic designation. Now, the caveat to this entire story is it didn't do anything to slow gentrification and displacement. That's an ongoing challenge, and we're still working on that. But at least in the public realm, people feel that their story is going to be told. So that sense of dignity of, we lived here, we lived a life. You know, we want to continue to live a life, but we want a touch point that's you can reference in the landscape came through. So that's an important story. Lastly, to be connected, and this will be very short, and I'll get through this quickly. To be seen, revealing things that are unseen and empowering them. To live with dignity, recognizing that that's really number one for a lot of communities, is to feel that they can live with grace and dignity, and they'll be remembered and they'll be honored, not just in the product, but in the process. To be connected, to then position those places to get access to broader exposure to resources, to networks, which is what we all enjoy. North Carolina has a lot of characteristics. One is that there are a lot of ongoing activities specifically targeted at Eastern North Carolina, because in our state, those are the poorest communities, or the places where the plantations used to be. Those are the places that are really devoid of a lot of economic development, and sort of all struggling with long-term chronic issues. One of those towns is the town of Princeville. Princeville is on the bottom of this diagram. On the top is Tarboro. So Tarboro was founded first. It's a place where George Washington visited before the United States was formed. It was also the home of the slave block. So in this diagram on the far right, you see Shiloh Landing labeled. It's a bend in the Tar River. It's the last navigable location of the Tar River. The Tar River actually flows into Virginia. So, it flows from Virginia, excuse me. So boats that brought enslaved Africans would come down to Shiloh Landing. They would walk along that green line, which is about 3.5 miles, cross over the Tar River to the selling block and be sold for work in the region. So a lot of our region's history can be characterized before and after the Civil War. Union soldiers came to this area as they started to defeat Confederate forces and claim property. Freed African people started to follow them and settle near those encampments. Where the Union encampment was, enslaved Africans would run to those places and self-build. This was one of those places. So in 1865, it was formally founded as a small town by African Americans called Freedom Hill. In 1885, name change to Princeville, named after Turner Prince, who was a prominent resident, built in the floodplain. Built in the floodplain because it was the only land that they could purchase from other owners. These are images of historic and current Princeville. We did workshops there immediately following Hurricane Matthew. Because of its low-lying condition, it was exposed to incredible risk. Many of the structures that you see in those pictures in black and white are gone because of recurring flooding there. But there's an incredible resilience there. And I'm going to skip through this part just to get to the conclusion that's more relevant. When we think about resiliency today, we're thinking about the impacts of climate change. We're thinking about what do we do? And we have to understand that some people have a place attachment. They're connected to their home places, even if rationally or intellectually or technically they shouldn't be there. And it's one of the biggest challenges facing a lot of African-American communities. We did workshops in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans, who are still, after over 16 years, trying to recover from Hurricane Katrina. And they're dealing with a similar issue where they're below sea level in New Orleans. So to a certain extent, you kind of go technically, well, you know, and then you go, well, they're only there because they were segregated and isolated and prevented from getting property on high ground in other parts of their community. And that's really a people problem and a policy issue, not a technical issue. And it's the sad part that those barriers still exist. But Princeville is important to us because, among other things, it's the first free charter town founded by Black people in the United States. So when people ask you, what's the first free charter town founded by Black people in the United States? It's Princeville. Most people don't know that story. Right? Passing that story down, and this is the image that I wanted to share for the cover. We'll race through these. These are the Enviro kids at promise as opposed to at risk. At risk is a kind of a coded term for people who don't meet certain stereotypes. Primarily kids who aren't doing as well as they could in school, but are intellectually curious and want to do new things, and are from the Raleigh area and had no idea about Princeville. So we said, hey, maybe this is an opportunity to connect and continue the story. So we hired people from Princeville to develop a walk, develop an interpretive element, and bring the kids through Princeville and talk about the history. And what they're looking at right now is Shiloh Landing. So when you look to the end of that picture, that river heads up into Virginia. So it's right at that spot where enslaved African people were disembarked from the boat and started the walk. It was really interesting because at this point they were captivated, right? This is on a pier looking out there, and you could hear a pin drop, and there were incredible questions being asked, and really forced them to grapple with a lot of issues that were there. Then we get to the museum, and as you can see, still damaged from Hurricane Matthew, which was over 3 years ago. So that tells you about resources and capacity and how slowly sometimes things change. So they go inside, no exhibits, everything's waterlogged. They're really disappointed, really angry. A bunch of teenagers, it's too hot, I gotta use the bathroom, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, you know, a lot of that stuff. Very useful information as landscape architect, to be honest with you. Oh, we need shade, places to sit, access to food, access to water, but very annoying in the moment. But their whole desire to learn more about this history, their thirst for it, inspired us to think about creatively what we could do in the meantime in terms of design. We persuaded a donor to give money, and we persuaded an architecture design build studio to create a mobile pop-up museum. So this thing was designed and built in 14 weeks. It's a modified trailer. The outside is intentionally designed to be a billboard for the town. The inside can be plugged in to power, air conditioned, museum, projector. It's one of these things that you can literally hook up to the back of a truck. It can sit in front of the current museum until it goes to mark that spot and activate that area. It could go to the Mall on Washington. It could go to the state capitol. It could go to universities and the schools. It could share this story of Princeville. It's not something we intended to do, and it has not tied to a lot of the landscape strategies we were proposing, but it filled a compelling need and inspired a whole generation of action. Trails, which you don't think are really significant, were significant in town. The ability to have designated places where people can either self-guided or in groups tour and learn about the place. It sounds very mundane, very simple. It's not. It's very complicated. That actually is something that is moving forward. And the idea that we tried to put forward was Greater Princeville, where after all of these storm events where it's been ravaged, we did discover there's high ground nearby. So rather than disassembling and relocating the town, growing the town to the high ground, using the lowland areas to really tell the story, the history, the heritage, and provide amenities in the short term, while we encourage people to build safely and resiliently on high ground. With that, I'm going to stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions or go over anything that I shared. Thank you.
Thank you, Kofi. So I will open things up for questions. You can either raise your hand in the participants list, or even just write your question into the Zoom group chat. And I'll try not to consume all the time with questions and let everyone else have have a chance here.
Okay, so there was one I wanted to respond to. What was the name of the scholar you mentioned that has been critical of Olmsted Sr.? Okay, so my professor at Michigan is a lady named Dorceta Taylor. So she was the one who introduced me to the critique of Central Park and the displacement of Seneca Village, which is one level of critique. The one I didn't reference tied to the Cotton Kingdom was a writer named J.T. Rohn. And I wrote that name in the chat, and who's a writer and an historian. And what JT was talking about was how Olmsted characterized life in the plantations. And the critique that JT makes is that Olmsted spent more time talking about how inefficient those landscapes were in terms of production, rather than advocating in the interest of the enslaved African people that were working the land. So it's a pretty powerful critique, and I can share a link to that article if people are interested, but that was the one I was referencing.
Great.
Yeah.
Other questions for Kofi?
I'll put that link in the chat. I think that someone is asking for that.
Kofi, I'll ask a question while others are thinking about what questions they have. For me, I guess I'm wondering a little bit about the history. I mean, if we just get even if we focus on the history of discipline and landscape architecture, and the way we've approached the way our kind of design methodologies, and the way we even frame the problems that we're addressing, and I think. In that, I guess I'd love to hear your opinion, or maybe even just expand on a little bit. We've developed a discipline that's gotten very good at outlining kind of issues issues within a site, and then we have a series of skills in our discipline to take care of that. And these are when I'm talking about typically around kind of environmental issues, formal issues, right? Like all of these kind of aspects in terms of how we're trained and how we approach that. I think in some ways. What I'm wondering is if for landscape architecture, one thing about it that we might address is really that approach, the one where we need to frame something as a problem in order to actually address it, right? And that in some ways, if we don't have a problem, we don't have a project, right? And many times, what we see is communities who have massive disinvestment in communities, centuries of systemic racism. We see communities who are on what we might call the precipice, that we then need to solve the problems in that community. But oftentimes this is what leads to kind of further gentrification, a whole range of things, because the problem is, it's defined in a way that really kind of excludes current communities' humanity in some way. So I'm wondering how you might see that as kind of an issue in landscape architecture, or if you think it is an issue.
I mean, that's a great question, Brad. I think it's vexing because, there's a lot of layers to it. One is we're largely a fee-for-service profession, right? So a lot of our work is client-driven. So we're asked to meet the needs of a client, which I would broaden to include a community. And so in some cases, we're told what we're supposed to do, right? And we're allocated a certain amount of resources in order to accomplish that task. But
right.
I'm familiar with your work and other people's work who figured out how to subvert that a little bit, say that, you wanted us to look at X, but we're going to look at Y and Z as well. That puts a lot of pressure on the actual practitioner to have those technical skills to be able to do that. But I think that's at the root of it, which is, and that's where the whole environmental justice movement kind of came from, which was the, the framing of the mainstream environmental movement excluded, issues and people that weren't a part of that process. So finding ways, because I think we do need resources in order to work, but it may not always fit the client fee-for-service model. And so finding creative ways to resource work that extends beyond that. And so, I mean, that's an advantage that institutions have. And I think they're really important in partnerships on really complicated issues, because as long as we can be productive scholarly, the duration of our involvement is really endless, So there seems to be a recurring theme that, I admire the Detroit Collaborative Design Center a great deal. So the work that they're doing there, they're tied to UD Mercy, and they're really focused on issues in their own backyard. And they've been working literally for decades on some projects. Ann Spern's work at Penn, there's a number of examples where, it's maybe not the fee-for-service professional designer carrying the load beyond their resources to deal with that particular issue, but reach out and building partnerships with those that can do other things. That 11th Street Bridge project is a great example where I guarantee OMA and Olin are not doing the heavy lifting on community engagement and that sort of thing. But they've creatively surrounded themselves with a team and with partners that are very good at that. And so, sometimes, it's just not in our wheelhouse and it's not in our skill set, and that's okay. But if you're aware of that need, then it's reaching out to form those partnerships and to attract, those additional resources. So.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. Looks like we have a question from John Michael P.
Yes. So in light of the recent events, the pandemic specifically, a lot of companies are moving to remote working or just decentralizing city center locations. How do you see like a new urban flight or remote working impacting lower income areas surrounding the city centers?
It's a really great question. Thanks for that question, John. I think there's a debate about it right now. I know right when COVID hit, there were a lot of really high-powered urbanists who were using that moment to advocate for massive changes to the public realms of cities to deal with those particular issues. So for example, widening sidewalks, closing streets for bikes, to bikes only, no cars, advocating for the need for more public spaces, a lot of these things, in which case that high amenity investment was indicative of what you're talking about, a fear that without that people would be afraid that in very dense areas that rely on particularly public transportation like subways, that there was just inherent danger in those places. And so there were all of these really big, fast, grand schemes being hatched all over the place in response to that. In which case you could say that would counterbalance that fear, right, of density and proximity. And it was tied to historical precedent, which is to say, it's really interesting to look at what happened in cities after the flu, influenza pandemics of the early 20th century. That's really coinciding with the City Beautiful movement, and it's coinciding with we need to make big, broad boulevards, and grand parks. You need to treat anything that's civic at the grand scale. So there's a precedent in 100 years ago of pandemic. Oh my God, what are we going to do with these dense areas? Well, we need to create a better landscape, better public landscape, sort of in response to that, right? And Central Park is fascinating because there's a public health history to Central Park, which is to say people thought that people in low-lying areas and swampy areas would get sick. And particular illnesses had benefited from elevation, from alpine landscapes, from dairy, which is a weird kind of correlation, but dairy products. So that being said, that's one side of the game, in which case you can imagine a healthier city that's more democratic and greener in response, to the pandemic. The other side, though, is dealing with the larger social structure of cities. So there already was a movement of displacement of Black and brown and working class people from city centers to what are called inner ring suburbs. It was already going on because particularly since the 90s, there's been specific federal policy that's incentivized reinvestment in city centers. So if there was no pandemic, that displacement was going to happen anyway. And that's the conversation that's happening now is this pause in how we're dealing with things a way to regroup and think about how those most affected can be better connected to the benefits of the new city that's coming, or not? Do we just go to the trend that's going the other way? Cynically, I would say that bus is left. And what I've learned about affordable housing in particular is that it's a regional issue. It's not a neighborhood or a community issue, which is to say successful affordable housing strategies in particular, which has a disproportionate impact on Black and brown communities, communities of color, is really tied to regional incentives and strategies. So I do see a meltdown happening where fewer physical infrastructure for those communities and cities, at least in America. Hopefully with the benefit of better connections, better amenities, better resources, but that I don't know how to disrupt what has occurred in the last 30 years in particular, which is wealth returning to city center, therefore wealthy people. That's a very hard thing.
Great, thank you. If there's 3 questions in the chat, Kofi, and then I have one person who wants to ask a question also whenever. So we have 4 kind of queued up.
No problem. Let me see.
So the first one's with Erica Shapiro-Sakashita.
All right. I learned a while ago the concept of blots in Detroit, properties between the size of lots and blocks that city residents were informally absorbing into their own ownership. Do you have any insights on the current status of Detroit's socio, cultural, ecological landscapes? I do, but it's a long-winded answer. I would direct you to the City of Detroit's planning department, which wouldn't necessarily be a great link, but one thing that happened, Brad, you know this guy, but Maurice Cox, who actually used to be mayor of Charlottesville and also architecture faculty at UVA, was the planning director at City of Detroit until recently. He's now to Chicago. But when he took over the planning department, he fired all the planners and hired architects and landscape architects. And actually some really prominent UVA alumni are leading the landscape component of that. So their department has some recent work that's really progressive that gets at that. So I would direct you to the City of Detroit's planning department.
Luckily also, Alexa Bush is part of this Summer Design Institute lecture series, and she's the perfect person to talk to. She'll be here and she can answer that question.
So I'm the pun on that one. So could you talk a little bit more about, this is Leah, how attention to Black placemaking changes the way we engage in historic research of our sites? How do the questions we ask the sites, types, the evidence, unearth, subvert the issues of racism within the historic record? That's a good question too. There's a good organization called Black Space. One of the leaders is a guy named Justin Garrett Moore. They have a symposium coming up in August called Black Spaces, and this is the only, Places in Spaces. That's online, I think it's free. And this is the topic of that symposium. So I would direct you to that group because he's assembled a pretty incredible group of people to have that conversation. And in short, I think because of the nature of our field and the difference between who we are versus the communities we serve, some communities see our engagement as extractive, meaning we spend a lot of time trying to get information out of them and they don't feel that it's being reciprocated, meaning we think that it's worth it because it will inform our design work in the end. And that value will be recaptured in the fabulous work we produce. But I've learned that there's a faster cycle that a lot of communities are asking for, which is more of a mutuality to how things work. And so, you know, the cell phone thing sounded kind of superfluous, but one thing that was really interesting about it was, first of all, the skill transfer. Meaning we dealt primarily with seniors who had no idea how to use, you know, this incredible technology we carry around in our pockets. So that was one. But the other one was the immediacy and utility of those stories through these videos. So they're passing them to their relatives, they're sharing them with their city council people, they're doing all these amazing things just because of that. And the current thinking is finding ways to literally compensate community partners, because a lot of folks are like, well, if you're a designer, you're getting paid. Or if you're in a school, you got a research grant, you expect me to come to all these community meetings at night for free? Like, I ain't doing that. And it's reasonable. So a lot of folks are thinking creatively about how to literally pay people a living wage to deal with that discrepancy. So I think that there's definitely some things about history that are charged and that can lead to conflict, but I found that that's less contentious than the actual process by which we engage each other and people not feeling like that's fair. So directing it that way.
Thanks, Kofi. So, I'm gonna just maybe if Chloe Nagraj wants to chime in really quick. She had her hand raised in between here.
No problem.
Thank you. Thank you for the really great talk. So my question, it's kind of about how landscape architects sit between how you're talking about the environmental justice movement and the fee-for-service business model. And I specifically wanted to ask about how you see the most generative place for landscape architects to more directly engage with policy in terms of questioning policy, moving policy forward, pushing against it. If you can speak a little bit on that.
That's a great point. Thank you for that question, Chloe. It's a big one. We didn't talk about Landscape Architecture Foundation yet. If you're not familiar with that, I encourage you all to take a look at it. But we do talk about that a lot. And I'll talk about just a few very short examples. ASLA, American Society of Landscape Architects, has an advocacy group whose whole mission is to, or government affairs, excuse me, that proposes advocacy. So Roxanne Blackwell's group. And every year there are issues that are floated up at state chapters that are important at the policy level, and they assemble local people, local members, either students or practitioners, to go and to meet and present and have conversations with formally with policymakers, right? So one big issue that they've been very successful in is defending licensure, which is to say landscape architecture is a professional field where licensure is a part of it, just like engineering and other fields. And in some states, people challenge that licensure, which weakens the position of landscape architecture in some ways. So they've been very successful at mobilizing and advocating for that. And I think that number two after that is transportation policy. So the ideas of what are called complete streets, not when you're dealing with federal funding for transportation, not just putting it in asphalt and traffic signals, but bike lanes, stormwater best management practices, deal with runoff, non-mobilized motorized transportation. There's a lot of unity and a lot of power there in terms of policy and advocacy. Where we are having some hard times though, and where we're looking to the next generation for more energy, is climate change and social justice. That for a lot of reasons, those are very difficult, and particularly in this political environment, to advance in those areas. So Billy Fleming, who's at the McHarg Center, is a great advocate and champion for climate change at the policy scale. And I see in the future more think tanks, centers, advocacy groups that are really focused on that aspect of what we do. Because Brad mentioned it before, but landscape architecture is unique because we operate at multiple scales. So if you're not dealing with scales beyond the site, what you can control, then, you know, for something like climate change, you're not really doing nothing. So it's important to have those elements.
Great. Well, we're really putting you to work tonight, Kofi. There's two more questions. Hopefully that's okay.
I'm good. I appreciate you all being present. It's no problem.
So Madeline Smith has a question here.
Okay. Can you speak to restorative justice design field further? What is your perspective on the role of restorative justice as a means to uplift systematically oppressed communities? All right, it's a great question, Madeline. Thank you. Deanna Van Buren kind of owns this space, in my opinion. Designing justice, designing spaces. It's a practice she's developed in the Bay Area, in Oakland, California. She's an architect. But she has done remarkable work working with incarcerated people, informally incarcerated people, to think about the whole trajectory, like mass incarceration, what happens within prison systems, and then what happens when you get out. So she's, I think, by far the leader in the clubhouse in terms of that thinking. Julie Stevens, who's at Iowa State, has done incredible work with the Iowa State prison system, particularly working with incarcerated mothers. And she actually has led design build projects within prisons, working with incarcerated women to build gardens where they can connect with their families and with their children when they come to visit. And so Julie is fascinating because she'll tell you that when she came into it, she had no idea what was going on. It was all learning along the way. But she's really thought through a lot of issues of how to teach it, how to benefit from it, how not to exploit people, how to deal with it. So those two ladies, in my opinion, are really the ones who are setting the bar for how we can approach it, both from a process and a product standpoint.
I think there's one more in there, Kofi.
Multi-ethnic community has landscape design needs. What should be done? How should landscape design face the complex social reality, or other words, some opposition? Okay, from Stephen. Thank you, Stephen. You know, I think I don't have like a generic answer to that one. I think that part of it is the relationship you have with the communities that you serve. And I think it's a conscious decision. So by way of analogy, I gotta go to the dentist tomorrow. My dentist is a Chinese American lady, right? Never had an issue cross-culturally because I think she knows what she's doing, that she has a code of ethics, that she's technically competent. I don't know anything about teeth. I just want to have teeth, right? So it doesn't even get to the point of like, well, she have to deal with certain kind of thing because I'm a black man, or do I have to deal with certain kind of thing because she's a Chinese American lady? Nope, doesn't even come up, right? I think it's unfortunate that we have to have these conversations in built environmental work. I wish it was just like that, which is like, I assume that you're competent. I assume that you know what you're doing. I assume from that side. From the other side, I assume that we're gonna have a good relationship and I'm gonna do the best project for you. Sadly, life's not like that. So all I can say is that's somewhat generic, is to go through some steps to get to know each other before you start deciding what to do. Build in a little bit of time to get to know the place, get to know the people, so that you can then deploy your incredible technical skill set to the best of your ability.
What a great answer. Thanks. Kofi, thanks so much. It's great to see you. It's great to have you. And we appreciate your time.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Brad. Thanks, everybody. Y'all have a good evening.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.